All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tearing into some seriously fascinating source material that completely flips the script on a massive recent event, the heavily publicized May 2026 UAP data dump. You know the one, those blurry photos and grainy video clips dropped by the Department of War that had the entire internet buzzing about interdimensional portals and off-world tech. Well, the documents we're analyzing today, they present a wildly different and honestly a much more grounded narrative. So let's dive in and see what the source material claims is actually hiding right in front of us. So, right off the bat, the text asks us to step back and question the bait. When you look at those murky, low-res photographs from the 2026 release, the immediate, almost knee-jerk question is, are we literally looking at extraterrestrial scout ships? I mean, the public narrative definitely pushes us in that direction, right? It makes us feel like the government is finally inching towards full alien disclosure. But our source material sets up this massive bait-and-switch. It argues that the real, terrifying secret isn't little green men, it's something entirely human. And that leads us to a real gut punch of a claim. The text explicitly states they are classifying their own hardware as unidentified to maintain plausible deniability. Let that sink in. According to the source, the objects in those blurry photos, not alien ships, no way. They are actually 30-year-old human-built machines. The allegation is that the military is digging up decades-old footage of its own highly classified test flights and conveniently slapping a modern UAP sticker on them. The source frames the whole May 2026 release as an absolute masterclass in something called a limited hangout strategy. If you're not familiar, a limited hangout is a counterintelligence move where you release a tiny, heavily sanitized fraction of the truth just to distract everyone from a much larger, way more damaging reality. The document argues this entire data dump was carefully curated to feed us degraded, blurry glitches, specifically to keep us away from the pristine, high-definition sensor data they absolutely possess. Okay, so let's walk through the actual crime scene here, the May 2026 UAP dump itself. What did trained aerospace observers actually see in that dump? The source points out that to a trained eye, those images do not show sleek, magical, solid-state off-world tech. Not even close. Instead, what the Department of War released were murky, low-res photos of clunky, heavy metal, literally riveted vehicles. The documents argue that this is clear-cut, early-generation terrestrial engineering. We're talking brute force human manufacturing from decades ago, not some elegant alien design. Which begs the question, why do we only get the blurry garbage? Well, the text breaks down this brilliant bureaucratic shell game. It contrasts Title 10 with Title 50. Title 10 covers your standard unclassified or minimally classified military operations. The source literally calls this the unclassified trash can that gets fed to the public. But the good stuff, the high-definition multispectral data, that's locked away under Title 50, which governs covert intelligence operations. Specifically, the source claims this pristine proof is buried in a hyper-compartmentalized shadow database called Immaculate Constellation, totally out of reach for any public investigator. So, if we aren't looking at aliens, let's examine the physical evidence. It's time to meet the Fluxliner ARV. If they aren't alien scout ships, what exactly are they flying? The source identifies these things as early-generation alien reproduction vehicles, or ARVs. Sometimes you'll hear them called Fluxliners. The text describes the ARV as this crude, heavy metal precursor to modern anti-gravity craft. Think of it as the 1980s Model T of a deeply classified secret space program. It was basically human engineers trying to brute force the physics of anti-gravity using old-school Cold War-era materials. So how exactly does a giant, heavy metal bell fly without a jet engine? The source claims it's basically a scaled-up version of a 1920s physics experiment called the Biefeld-Brown effect. The text details how an onboard nuclear source pulses millions of volts of direct current straight into massive capacitor plates built right into the floor of the ship. By rapidly firing that extreme voltage in a rotating sequence, it generates a localized mass reduction field. Basically, the craft is surfing on an artificially generated wave of gravity. Pretty wild, right? And the source grounds this whole narrative by naming actual real-world locations. It claims that all throughout the 1980s and 90s, these massive human-piloted ARVs, these early stealth variants, were actively being test-flown over restricted airspace out west. The documents specifically call out the Tonopah test range and the Dugway proving ground. This wasn't happening in deep space. It was happening right here in the American desert.
So where's the proof? Let's check the receipts, specifically looking at the engine technology. To back up these massive claims, the source points straight to a hard paper trail sitting right out in the open at the U.S. Patent Office. It heavily references this exact number, U.S. Patent 2420864. This is a foundational 1947 patent for something called a barium titanate dielectric. Now check out the timing here, because the text points out how wild this is. This patent was granted in May 1947. That's exactly 2 months before the infamous Roswell crash. So while the government was publicly denying flying saucers, defense contractors were aggressively patenting the exact exotic ceramics you'd need to build one. The absolute key here is understanding what barium titanate actually does. The source calls it the magic dielectric. Now, a dielectric is just an insulator inside a capacitor, but barium titanate acts as the ultimate electrical sponge. Because it has this massive dielectric constant, it can hold back terrifying amounts of electrical pressure. It can literally bottle up the lightning required to warp gravity without shattering or melting. And according to the documents, massive blocks of this very specific ceramic were used to build the floor plates of the ARVs. And the source shares this mind-blowing acoustic detail that perfectly explains decades of witness reports. Barium titanate isn't just an electrical sponge. It is highly piezoelectric. That means when you hit it with electricity, it physically changes shape. It vibrates. The text explains that the terrifying deep hum people always report around these craft isn't a mechanical engine. The craft is essentially a giant vibrating piezoelectric speaker, physically humming as millions of volts slam into its ceramic floor thousands of times a second. Okay, so if we've had this tech since the 80s, who are the accomplices? Let's look at the bureaucratic shell game keeping it hidden. How on earth do you hide a massive, vibrating, anti-gravity machine from the public and from Congress for decades? The text lays out a really clear timeline. First, in the 1940s and 50s, foundational materials like barium titanate are patented. Fast forward to the 1980s and 90s, and these brute force, human-piloted ARVs are being built and flown. During that era, any accidental footage caught by civilians or regular military gets quickly confiscated. Then, finally, in the 2020s, the Pentagon reaches into the vault, pulls out that old footage, slaps a UAP label on it, and releases it to a totally confused public. And here is where the compartmentalization gets brilliantly simple. The document explains that when an uncleared commercial or Navy pilot filmed one of these ARV test flights back in the 90s, that footage was handed over to uncleared military desk clerks. Because the ARV was a deeply classified special access program, the clerks processing the film genuinely had zero idea what they were looking at. To them, it was a UFO, so they completely accurately filed it as unknown or unidentified. The source also details a super clever jurisdictional trick used to hide the actual physical hardware. See, if the government owns a crashed ship or a working prototype, it's government property, which means it's subject to Freedom of Information Act or FOIA requests. So what's the workaround? The text claims they transferred the hardware to private aerospace contractors, think Lockheed and Boeing, under the protection of corporate independent research and development. Private corporations are exempt from FOIA. Just like that, the technology becomes legally untouchable by the public. All of this brings us to the ultimate question. The motive, laundering the black budget. We've seen the hardware, we've seen the cover-up mechanisms, so let's finally look at the why. This is the core thesis of our explainer. The source argues that the Pure Soup protocol, that big May 2026 data release, is, at the end of the day, a mechanism for laundering the Black Fleet by officially classifying their own legacy, human-built hardware as unidentified. The Pentagon is effectively laundering its own stolen tax dollars. They siphoned trillions from the public to build these incredible machines, and now they are playing dumb, pretending they have no idea what's flying around up there. According to the documents, the true goals of this whole UAP psychological operation have absolutely zero to do with alien contact. It's about protecting a multi-trillion-dollar aerospace monopoly held by those major contractors. It's about keeping a parallel financial system, the black budget, completely hidden. And above all, it's about maintaining plausible deniability, ensuring that the engineers and directors of these highly illegal, unacknowledged programs never ever have to face Congress or answer for the patents they hid from humanity. I absolutely love how the source summarizes this. There's a quote that says, "They feed the public a flawed lens to protect the perfect machine. By purposely releasing highly degraded glitches, thermal artifacts, and blurry 30-year-old photos of clunky ARVs, the intelligence apparatus is essentially giving the internet permission to go crazy with alien theories.
It's a brilliant, self-sustaining smokescreen designed specifically to hide the actual functional physics of their deeply classified terrestrial fleet.
It all builds to this one overarching realization that yanks all these wild claims right back down to Earth. The deepest, darkest secret, according to this source material, isn't that aliens are hiding from us. It's that human engineers, driven by human greed and funded by stolen tax dollars, spent 80 years building a multi-trillion-dollar counterfeit armada, and they've been using it to surveil and manage us ever since.
So, as we wrap up, based on the documents we've explored today, we really have to ask ourselves, is the current public push for disclosure actually about finding extraterrestrial life, or is it just a carefully orchestrated legal and media strategy designed to protect a multi-trillion-dollar aerospace monopoly from ever having to open its books to the public? It completely reframes every single thing we hear about UFOs. Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the narrative. Catch you next time.